Hey everybody, Tim Parrish here for the Huntington Church of Christ, and welcome to Wednesday in the Word. Sometimes the great characters of Scripture are those people who are kind of elevated by God in the narrative, but their exploits are big and their accomplishments are many, and sometimes it's hard to notice all of the other people that are a part of their story, all the other individuals that make up that narrative. And I think it's very important for us to know that there's almost no one in Scripture who does mighty things or who accomplishes great deeds for the Lord without a supporting cast. And a lot of those supporting cast members are kind of off stage. We don't see them much. Maybe we only know their name. Maybe we only know one time that they kind of show up and then they disappear. Well, there is a group of those supporting characters that really are an amazing group when you stop and consider their stories and their exploits. In fact, we're just going to kind of take the 30,000-foot overview of these guys this evening. And then maybe next week we'll come back. There's one in particular that I'd kind of like to come back and talk about because his story kind of gets expanded a little bit, and there are some things that we see about him that we don't know about just everybody else. But these men together collectively are often referred to as David's mighty men. David's mighty men. You may remember that during the time that David was on the run in fear for his life at the hand of King Saul, David had a group of men that kind of came out and joined themselves to him, a rather large group at times, that were loyal to him. They kind of formed an unofficial army. Well, this is a separate group of men. They were a part, I think, of that larger group. But they're kind of singled out here. There is a list of 30 names. Sometimes you see references made then to 37, just depending on the actual naming. And you find these men and just kind of the overview of their story in 2 Samuel chapter 23. And that's where we're going to be. If you'd like to compare, if you're somebody who likes to read similar accounts and see the things that are the same and the things that are different, you might also turn over into the book of 1 Chronicles chapter 11. And there's just a little bit there about these men as well. But for tonight's purpose, for this study, we're going to focus on what is written about them in 2 Samuel. Now, you'll remember that David was chosen by God to be the second king of Israel. Saul, chosen by God to be the first king, anointed by Samuel the prophet. And it seems at first he was a good king, but then you know that the Spirit of God left him and an evil spirit of some sort came in its place, and Saul kind of lost it. He kind of went crazy, and God told him the kingdom will not be yours forever. This is not going to be a good story for you as far as the ending is concerned. And so that's where David comes in, and at first their relationship seems to be good. David sort of hired to be the music therapist for Saul, because David could come in and with his songs and his poems and his musical ability, he was able to kind of bring Saul down a little bit and calm him. But of course that didn't last forever, and Saul eventually decided he needed to kill David to eliminate him as a threat to the throne. Now, if he'd have thought that through, he would have known that as one anointed by God, there would be no killing him or stopping this thing from happening. But nonetheless, we don't always think rationally and clearly when we're at our best, not to mention when things are not going great for us. Now, we meet these guys because, as I mentioned already, they have come to be allies of David. They are loyal to David. They supported him militarily. They supported him politically. They supported him as friends. In fact, one of the particular incidents we'll see this evening really shows the depth, not just of their loyalty to him as their commander, but I think it speaks volumes of the way they really felt about David and the relationship that existed between these men. This comes at a very interesting place because in chapter 23, my Bible opens with the heading, David's last words. And then when you get to chapter 24, you find David taking the census. And at the end of chapter 24 is the end of 2 Samuel. And it's not a great place because of what happens as a result of David building or taking the census when he wasn't supposed to. And we have to read farther into the text to know some of the things that happen after that. But sandwiched in between David taking the census and this section called David's Last Words is just the heading, David's Mighty Men. So I want to begin reading in 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse number 8. And these are the names of the mighty men whom David had. Joseph-Basshebeth, a Tachamonite. He was chief of the 3. He wielded his spear against 800, whom he killed at one time. And next to him among the 3 mighty men was Eleazar, the son of Dodo, the son of Ahoai. He was with David when they defied the Philistines who were gathered there for battle, and the men of Israel withdrew. He rose and struck down the Philistines until his hand was weary, and his hand clung to his sword. And the Lord brought about a great victory that day, and the men returned after him only to strip the slain. And next to him was Shammah, the son of Agi the Harorite. The Philistines gathered together at Lehi, where there was a plot of ground full of lentils, and the men fled from the Philistines. But he took his stand in the midst of that plot, and he defended it, and he struck down the Philistines, and the Lord worked a great victory. And 3 of the 30 chief men went down and came about harvest time to David at the cave of Adullam, when a band of Philistines was encamped in the valley of Rephaim. And David was then in the stronghold, and the garrison of the Philistines was then at Bethlehem. And David said longingly, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem that is by the gate." Then the 3 mighty men broke through the camp of the Philistines and drew water out of the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate and carried it to David. But he wouldn't drink it. He poured it out to the Lord and said, "Far be it from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Should I drink the blood of these men who went at the risk of their lives?" Therefore, he would not drink it. These things the 3 mighty men did. Now notice we're dealing with 3 out of a group. And these 3 are singled out, which I think is really interesting, that David had 3 that were separate from even the larger group that were with him and loyal to him. I see the same kind of pattern in what Jesus did. Jesus had the 12, but then he had Peter, James, and John. Those were the 3 that were with him most often, even when the group went somewhere and then they would go a little bit farther, only sometimes those 3 would go with him. Now, I don't know if there's any spiritual significance to the number 3 here or to the fact that there are 3 of these men. Maybe it's just a simple statement of fact. But these 3 guys, Jashub-Basshebeth, or Jashabim, sometimes you see him called, Eleazar, and Shammah. And if this was all we knew about these guys, it would tell us the caliber of men that they were. Notice, first of all, that Jashabim is a guy who, according to the scriptures here, is kind of the captain of the captains. He's the head man over all the mighty men. Even among the 3, he's the one who's kind of elevated to a position of leadership and authority. But notice that the first thing that we read about him is that there was a time when he withstood and defeated 800 enemy soldiers. 800. Now, I really would like to have the fuller story. I'd like to know exactly what happened and who all was involved and what the finer details of this thing were. All we can know is that he was here and there were 800 enemy soldiers, and he stayed there with his spear and defeated them at once. The second of those 3, Eleazar, he's always kind of stuck out in my mind because of this one detail, that he fought so much and so long with the sword that literally his hand just clung to it. Now, I don't know if you've ever had that experience with a sword, but maybe if you've ever chopped wood for a long time, maybe if you've ever hoed in a garden or a cotton patch, or maybe you've ever used a set of post hole diggers, you understand that idea that in that labor that your hands almost get frozen in position and almost like you have to unwrap them from the handle of whatever that tool is. Well, that's what I see with Eleazar here, that everybody else left, but Eleazar fought. He fought alone, and he fought for David, and he fought until he couldn't even let go of his sword. And then you see Shammah. Shammah is in the middle of a field, and and everybody else runs away. And I wonder if Shammah's fierceness in that fight is because his people, David and the other soldiers, they needed the food. And maybe this was even a secret plot that they had planted, kind of a secret garden so that they could have something to eat, and it was discovered by the enemy. I don't know if there's significance to this plot of lentils. Some places it's referred to as barley. It's kind of hard to know exactly what they're raising here, but either way, this was a needed supply, and right in the middle of that, we find Shammah. And then there is this water incident. And we're not told which three, but since three are named before the rest, we can assume that these three are the one who go on this water mission. And I love the way this plays out. And for a long time, I didn't really understand this, especially when I was young, and I would hear this story. I just didn't grasp, especially David's reaction or David's response. But it's a pretty simple story. David's just sitting around. They're down there with him. The Philistines are inhabiting the city of God, Bethlehem, and this is not good. And David's just kind of dreaming of the way things used to be, and how, boy, you know what, nothing would be better than, you know, the taste of that water. Oh, if I could just have some of that water. Well, it wasn't so much that David wanted that water. David wanted everything that water represented. David wanted the Philistines gone from Bethlehem. He wanted to be living back in that place, and for the people of God to be in that place. It was a sense of nostalgia almost. But do you notice that these three men, whichever three, we assume the three first named, their love for David is so deep that whatever the risk, these three men were willing to infiltrate the stronghold of the Philistines to get David some water from one well. As far as we know, David had water to drink, but it wasn't that water. It was that connection to everything being right and normal. And maybe there's been some of that you've kind of felt. Maybe you don't necessarily want to drink water from some particular well, but you definitely are craving things in some sense the way they used to be. And so here, these three men show their loyalty to him, but to me, their deep love and friendship for him by doing this. And David says, "Are you kidding me? I can't drink this water. You risked your life. It would be as I was signing your death warrant, like I sent you for it. I sure didn't mean for you to go get it. This is not what I had in mind." And so, beautiful image of these men, some of them not really thought highly of in the rest of society, who have found a place of belonging, a sense of purpose, with that loyalty and friendship in the service of David. Well, we pick back up in the text in verse number 18. Now Abishai, the brother of Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was chief of the 30, and he wielded his spear against 300 men, and killed them, and won a name beside the 3. He was the most renowned of the 30, and became their commander, but he did not attain to the 3. And Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was a valiant man of Kabzeel, a doer of great deeds. He struck down 2 Ariels of Moab. He also went down and struck down a lion in a pit on a day when the snow had fallen. And he struck down an Egyptian, a handsome man. The Egyptian had a spear in his hand, but Benaiah went down to him with a staff and snatched the spear out of the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. These things did Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, and he won a name beside the 3 mighty men. He was renowned among the 30, but he did not attain to the 3. And David set him over the bodyguard. And Asahel, the brother of Joab, was one of the 30. And then begins a list of names that, though at one time I could pronounce, well, you see I'm already struggling with some of these Hebrew names. And really what we have is just a listing of who all these people were. Really many of them just with maybe a name and the town where they grew up. And I don't really want you to pay a lot of attention to those names. Not that they don't matter. I'm the one trying to tell you in this lesson that the behind the scenes people really matter. But I want you to pay special attention to the last name listed there in the end of chapter 23. Notice in verse 39, Uriah the Hittite. Uriah the Hittite. Does that name sound familiar to you? It should. Uriah was a guy who had a beautiful wife named Bathsheba. And we know a little bit about Uriah, and we'll come back maybe in a future lesson and talk a little bit about him. But this group here of 30, and then at the end you read 37 in all. This group of 30 was kind of a special forces unit. They were David's personal security. They were sort of a special ops unit that took care of covert missions that were very important. But notice these other two that are mentioned. Notice Abishai. And what is said about him is that he was elevated as a commander of the 30. He was the most honored of the 30, but he never attained to the reputation, the level of those first three that we mentioned. And then there's Benaiah, also elevated and given a prominent spot in the security force, kind of the head of the Secret Service, if you will, but still not attaining to the three. And no one else seems to reach that level. But if you notice about Abishai is Joab's brother, and Joab was one of David's greatest military commanders, one of his captains. And you see Joab's exploits elsewhere. And I think maybe that's just mentioned as a point of reference for us. Maybe it's something about their family and the kind of men that they were. But notice what it says about him, that on one occasion, he killed 300 men by himself. And he killed a giant. He killed a giant. Well, that kind of goes back to what David did with Goliath. And apparently it was not uncommon for there to be these giants in the military forces. And so we see them there. Then you meet Benaiah. And he's one that I definitely want us to come back and talk about. Not just because I have a little cousin named Benaiah, but Benaiah is a guy whose exploits are pretty impressive. In fact, the two that are kind of mentioned here, that he went down and fought a lion in a pit on a day that it had been snowing. I mean, who does that, right? Who is brave and valiant and courageous enough to take that on? Well, Benaiah was, and he did it. He also fought against a man classified as a giant, and that guy had a spear that he was going to kill Benaiah with, and Benaiah had a shorter club, a staff, a short, well, my heritage would make me want to call it a shillelagh, and he went down and used it to literally take away the giant's spear and turn it back on him. Now, for those of you that happen to be watching and you are testosterone oriented, you like action movies, you like adventure, you like all those things, well, these are some stories of these mighty men that really ought to stir you up. They really ought to get you going and engaged in what's happening here with David and the kingdom. And yet I wonder sometimes exactly why these guys are here. There are about 17 more mentioned in the Chronicles account. I mentioned that to you earlier, 1 Chronicles chapter 11. There's 17 other men whose names are not listed here. And then there is the mention of another 30 under the leadership of a guy named Zabad or Zabad. And that really doesn't tell us much more that we didn't already know. So why did I want you to see these people, and why would we take the next couple of weeks and come back and look at some of these individuals in particular? Well, it's because for all the things we know about David, and for the way that David is still revered to this day, it's important to know that David did not get to where he was just because he was anointed by God, just because God had given him his spirit. Sometimes we look at some of those figures like Samson and some of those other judge figures who seem to be single-handedly doing these amazing things. And if you look at the men in our story, David's mighty men, you might come away with the idea that they too are kind of singled out for their exploits, for their valiant loyalty. Well, don't miss this. Don't miss the fact that when you look at these guys, they are all in the background. Because the prevailing story here is that of David. But had these guys not been here doing what they did, David couldn't have accomplished what he did. For instance, Benaiah is one of the ones who, after David died, secured the throne and helped to put Solomon on the throne. We'll talk about him again a little bit later. But it's important to note that all these things are happening in David's life, again, because there are so many people whose names maybe are just mentioned one time and we don't know anything else about them. I think this is really important, okay? So I want you to listen very carefully. In the church today, it is really easy for people like me who have a job, who are, well, during this season on camera, often on stage, up front, visible, vocal, to be viewed as the leader in such a way that whatever good is accomplished by a church, or maybe even whatever bad is accomplished by a church, that one person is, it's during that era, that person's era, that these things happen or didn't happen. But through my years, I have known so many people in the church who were never on the stage. In fact, it'd be really easy in a public gathering to miss them because they might not ever say anything out loud. And yet, the commitment that they had to the Lord, the commitment that they had to the church, to the Bible, to evangelism, to missions, to the mission of the local church. There's just no way. There's no way that I could have done anything that I've done in my almost 30 years of preaching if it hadn't been for all those people who have surrounded me and supported me and helped me, and most of their names the average person would never recognize. Not in that setting. Oh, they might have been important somewhere else, or they might have had a name for being something in their secular career, and it might not ever be known that they were such a vital part of what was happening in the church. But I love stories like this because they remind me that the church here where I preach is full of mighty men and women. Men and women whose names might not ever make it to the top of the marquee. Men and women who might not ever stand on the stage where I stand, who might not be making these kinds of teaching videos or having the opportunity to be recognized in public as the representative figure of that church. But these people, some of you watching right now, are so very important. And the church wouldn't be the church without you. And so I'm very thankful that these stories are here in Scripture. But I'm also very thankful that over in our New Testaments, the Apostle Paul reminds us that the church is a body made up of many different members, each with different functions, each set in place by God. Because that's why these mighty men are here, and it may just be that's exactly why you're here. Don't think that you don't matter. Don't think that somehow you're less than, or you're not significant, or you're not important. You're made in the image of God. Every person in every church is made in the image of God and thus has value and worth and significance. I'm thankful to God for the mighty men and women that have been a part of my journey. If that's you, some of you I know are watching. I don't want to call your name now because part of what makes you who you are is you don't want your name called. Well, I'm thankful for you. And I trust that as I move forward in my journey as a minister, I will continue to be surrounded by and supported by mighty men and women. Thanks for stopping by.